Good evening, good morning, everyone. Here is our latest episode of Deep Dive here on our podcast. Today's guest is a special friend, and I'm not saying it because he's now joining me, but it's because this goes a long, long time. I don't even remember it, but once upon a time, this gentleman was on the stage talking about South China Sea. I think this was an event co-organized by the Department of Foreign Affairs, FSI Institute, and Diplomatic Academy of the Philippines. Long time. I think it was 2010 or ish, and I was still a student back then. And there were a couple of people I remember from that discussion, and one of them I said, "Oh, this is a very young gentleman, and he seems to know a lot about military geeky stuff." And next thing you know, we're gonna be mates and friends for the next 10 years. So I'm super glad that now that we're not as young as before, but I think young enough we have kept the flame of friendship and continuing our passion and involvement. I will also say I feel genuine friendship with our guest today because I also see his solidarity with the Philippines and our struggle in the region in ways that I do not see with a lot of other people. So let's get the ball rolling. Dr. Colin Cott, thank you, Colin, joining us. Of course, you're speaking in your own private capacity. Let's be very clear. But of course, you can. His background is senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Singapore, among the best, sharpest guys from Singapore. So if Australia is down under and New Zealand is down under, Spore, is that how we're gonna call you guys? Joining us from
Spore.
Spore, yeah,
Spore, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so before that, let me just simply say, because I get this is somewhat a semi-formal discussion, so I will also try to be a little bit informal than to have to artificially be very prim and proper. And you know, Richard, we thanks so much for your very kind introduction, and I echo you as well. Our friendship dated a long time ago when we first sort of started off looking at regional issues, especially those on the South China Sea. And over the years, we read a lot, we seen a lot, and we have undergone quite a bit. And whatever we see today transpire from what we observed collectively in the past. So we have here a common affinity. And of course, I have to say that I really admire your work, Richard, because before I entered into the field, I have read a lot about your work, and I have also recommended your work to my Singaporean friends, including those who work in the ministries. That if you want to read someone who is an authority on Philippine politics and geopolitical affairs, then Richard Adrian is somebody that you have to speak to. In fact, I have a friend who was recently posted to Manila in the embassy, so I recommended that he reach out to you as well if he wants a very incisive take on Philippine issue and the broader Indo-Pacific. So it's my honor to be your friend, Richard, and of course, an equally great honor to be on your show. But you asked a question, how do you call Singapore? You know, I used to like to joke that we are a fine country.
Yeah.
We are a fine country in a metaphorical sense. Right? Say fine meaning it is good or because we issue too many fines, right? Because we have very strict laws in Singapore.
Well, as long as you're
Yeah.
not Sin City, I mean, I think Fine City is always better than Sin City.
Yeah. So we issue fines on everything, but since our discussion today will revolve a little around Singapore, so feel free to shoot any question, and as best as possible, I can address them. But really, this one is really something that I'm looking forward to. I'm sorry that we sort of delayed that. It should have been recorded earlier. So, Richard, thanks so much for taking your evening off to have this discussion with me.
Before getting into Singapore, and I don't want to put you in trouble, but we're gonna ask questions. I mean, I'm really proud of how our countries come, forward throughout the years, considering the difficulties we have, because both of us have very strong relations with the United
Mm,
States. We're an ally. You're an important partner to the Americans, and at the same time, of
mm.
course, there's China and the challenges that we face there. So before discussing that, I want to also add, Colin, your background is in engineering, right? Because mine is, I started pre-medical courses, dentistry, before I went to social. So sometimes I wonder also if our non-social science starting point perhaps may have influenced also how we approach this issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, in fact, this is the first time I hear from you that you had a non-social science background. You're right. I got my undergrad in material science and engineering. I remember when I first entered RSIS as a student. I mean, I'm glad that RSIS accepted me, given that they are in for what they call a multidisciplinary approach, right?
Right,
So we
right.
accepted one of those rare animals who came from engineering, which is me. And it was a culture shock because the way I write, I remember my a thesis supervisor who overlooked my who oversees my master's dissertation. So he looked at my first draft of my term paper, and the first comment he made was, "Colin, you wrote it like a lab report."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But he was very quick to chime in and say, "But Colin, that is not a paralysis of your ability to be a good social scientist, because the one thing that people like us who come outside from the social science circle is that first, we have very likely a very different perspective of how things is like, right? And that is one. Second is the way we organize our thoughts and synthesize them into writing could be very different from those who are trained from the scratch as a social scientist. So in my case, for example, he told me, and I thought that was very consoling for the whole day, on that very fateful day itself. He told me that, you could write in a methodical manner, which is good because
Yeah.
you could lay out your points clearly and in a very structured manner. So I was like, oh yeah, okay, so it's a redeeming feature, I guess, being an engineer. So I mean, in my whole course in RSIS, I bump into, of course, faculty who are somewhat nasty, and they cast a sort of a wary eye on me. They ask, why am I here in the first place, which is a weird
Ooh.
question to begin with. I'm there because of passion. Otherwise, I'd be gone to the semiconductor industry,
Yeah.
earning my big bucks, and
Exactly.
even free riding on the current, current geopolitical tensions over
Yeah.
chips, right? And,
Yeah.
and I've earned a lot, right? So the fact that I give up this opportunity and I entered into this new field is because of passion more than anything else. But they question why I'm there. But of course, there are those who, a small number who I'm still very grateful to this day. They did not prejudice where I come from, and they patiently sort of brought me into the field and teach me the ropes. So I always remember them. I mean, where I stand today, I'm not a big shot. At least maybe I might have some publishing and all that out there. But at least I could say that they play a very strong role in shaping who I am today. So I'm very grateful to all of them.
Thank you so much for that, Colin. I mean, I completely understand where you come from. I mean, if you look at the novels behind me, including War and Peace, they have highlights like anatomy, physiology, right? So my approach is very, very different. Of course, engineering folks are different. People from medical field are different. But I think what one thing we share is really passion for geopolitics, for regional security, and I think also passion for our countries in a sense that we want to have a voice on the international stage.
Yeah.
Colin, let's talk about Singapore.
Mm.
I know as Singaporeans you kind of feel weird because sometimes you feel you're over romanticized by other countries, and at the same time, perhaps sometimes you feel you're not as appreciated in terms of the challenges you face and the contribution you make in region. So, in the Philippines we have I think we call it first world problems or like being good looking problems. Yeah, it's our sarcastic way of saying, I know it's hard to be Singaporean, but can you tell me, Colin, how does it feel to be Singapore in the region? I don't want to put you on the spot, but the idea that you guys are an uber rich country in terms of per capita, you even have a higher per capita than the United States. I think you're top three or top five in the world. Well, thankfully, your neighbors are increasingly upper middle income. It's not like you're a bunch of banana republics, but in a way, you are in kind of a unique position. So, how do you make sure you keep I don't know, humble and not pontificate and all of that, considering how much ahead you are of everyone else, and everyone is, I call it Singapore envy. Like it used to be in the Philippines. Of course, I'm sure this is the case in Indonesia. Well, Thai people don't like you, but in Indonesia everyone talks about. But in the Philippines, it used to be always America, America. There's no such thing in America that kind. But now everyone talks about Singapore as a role model. Presidential candidates last year, everyone's talking about Lee Kuan Yew, right? So how do you feel about that? What do you think? What do you want to tell all these people having Singapore envy? Like, be careful what you wish for. Like what?
Yeah, bro, thanks for this question because, uh, you know, very often people outside Singapore look at Singapore as it is, right? It is full of skyscrapers, glitzy landscaping. Of course, the picture of Marina Bay Sands always come to mind, right? And that gives the impression that Singapore is a rich country. It is a highly metropolitan, which is true, of course. And of course, there are many of those untold stories behind Singapore itself. And the context is important. I think firstly is, of course, I appreciate being a Singaporean. Maybe I've done enough in my past life that earn me the afterlife of being a Singaporean, right? And I'm fortunate for that. I mean, some will argue that, hey, Colin, you should thank your grandfather who migrated all the way from Fujian province all the way down, and he made the right decision to make that perilous journey through the South China Sea to reach what they call Nanyang, right? Or South China Sea, for example, whatever they call that. So, in a way, I'm part of their legacy and their heritage. Just to share with you that my paternal grandfather is from China, but my maternal grandmother and my great grandmother from the maternal side was actually not pure Chinese. They were actually what we call Peranakan, Nyonya. So my lineage is somewhat a little bit.
You mean Malay? They had Malay background?
Yeah, some Malay background, and my great maternal grandmother actually did not live in back then called the Malayan Peninsula. She actually lived in back then what was known earlier to be Siam, which is today's Thailand. So southern part of Thailand, which of course now the deep south is a little bit of a problem, right? But it is a predominantly Muslim, population. And of course, today, if you go to Kelantan State, for example, in Malaysia, they trace their origins from Siam back then. That was before the Boundary Treaty that was signed between Siam and London, which sort of seek part of southern Thailand to the Malay Peninsula. So it was kind of complicated. So I have Chinese blood, which I believe to be the predominant bloodstream. I have Malay and what they call Siamese blood. It's complicated. Yeah. So that's how I will always try to tell my foreign friends. Say, for example, they say want to meet in Singapore, I'll bring them to eat nothing but Peranakan food, just to tell them, if you think Singapore is a Chinese nation, then you are severely mistaken.
Yes.
I serve and I want to show you Peranakan food because this is precisely a very important microcosm of Singapore itself, right? That is multiracial, multi-ethnic, and we have a very, very significant melting pot history of where we come about. And of course, you mentioned Lee Kuan Yew. It was interesting because it was a great revelation from you that, in the Philippines, Lee Kuan Yew was being talked about. I mean, there was some very important context to make. Of course, Lee Kuan Yew was successful during his time in Singapore for various reasons. One is that Singapore inherited what we will call a working bureaucracy from the British colonialists. Yeah. Yes. I mean,
exactly, yeah.
Colonialism isn't good, of course, right? But one will argue that there are some side products that you get from colonialism that could actually help in the development. Not to say colonialism is good, but the byproducts of it, you could get. So we inherited that. There was a working bureaucracy. So whenever there was this narrative that, Singapore used to be a fishing village. Yeah, maybe during Sang Nila's Utama's time. But,
exactly. Like it's a mosquito infested, blah, blah, blah. But no, you were already called the Gibraltar of Asia by Second World War. You were quite a developed place, right? Pretty sophisticated, pretty important to Britain.
Yeah, look, I mean, the reason why we were important was because of our geostrategic location. We have a deep sea harbor, and we basically were so well located in between the confluences of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So that is a geographical and geostrategic constant itself. And why the Japanese were so keen to get us back in 1941? Look, I mean, when they went through, Malaya and partly through Patani in Thailand, and they worked their way all the way down to the Malayan Peninsula, their grand prize was not so much the Malayan Peninsula, but the grand prize was actually Singapore. Because that is where they will stage all their naval operations in the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific Ocean. So, all these great powers recognize the importance of Singapore from the geostrategic sense. And today, fast forward to today, we found ourselves in the same situation somewhat. That we are, as you say, somehow we are smack in between the two powers, right? U.S., China, everyone seems to want to have a piece of us, and somehow it is something that we have to live with. It's a geostrategic constant we have to live with. It's a reality. At the same time, as you may know, Singapore, we love to say that we are very kiasu, right? we are scared of losing. That pretty much sums up what I see as the popular mentality in Singapore. You could even see the kiasu mentality manifested in our foreign policy as well. If you use the term kiasu mentality, that is very colloquial. However, if you use an academic term for that,
anticipatory-ish.
Anticipatory, or maybe I could call that siege mentality. A siege mentality, a type of thinking
Interesting.
that like you're constantly under threat from someone, something, and you have to be constantly on your toes. You have to be constantly trying to reinvent yourself and try to be relevant. Look, Singapore doesn't really publish what we call a foreign policy white paper, for example. But if you sort of pull together all the various public statements, as well as speeches and all that, you could actually distill all the way down to just a few important principles. One is that we have to stay relevant because we are a small country. And usually small countries, go back to history, go back in the old Peloponnesian times and all that. Small countries don't tend to survive very long in an intense geopolitical environment. You have to, of course, have good ties with everyone. I have to say that, while we appear to be sometimes hyper-competitive, but we want to compete in a way that is friendly. We don't want to be seen as sort of, jump-starting anyone, tripping someone from the back. We tend to give people the impression that we are over-competitive, sometimes at the expense of our neighbors. I know the older leadership in Malaysia love to say that we are happy on that expense, somehow along those lines.
They're not your fans. Malaysians are not your fans. They're not our fans too, so we have that in common. Malaysians don't like both Philippines and Singapore. Yeah.
Exactly. So what I will share with my friends is that just remember that Singapore is a melting pot.
Yeah.
It's a melting pot in a very interesting geopolitical neighborhood. Because of the fact we are a melting pot, I have to say, and this is my last rejoinder to that, is that because we're a melting pot, we are very conscious about our social fabric. The social fabric is what brings the whole nation together. Look, we are still trying to build a national identity. We have a very young nationhood to begin with. So we are trying to build a national identity, and what we do not want is some party coming in to tell them who we are.
Yeah.
That is something that we don't want. So it's directed at anyone, to be sure. So we are very conscious about that. So that's the reason why I, at the beginning, tell you that, when my foreign friends come, I'll bring them to eat Peranakan food. I want to impress upon them, this is our culture. I don't serve Chinese food. I do love Chinese food. I know many good Chinese restaurants in Singapore, but I insist on not bringing them there because it would have given them the impression that Singapore is Chinese. We are not Chinese. So we are Southeast Asian, like you, like your country, Richard. Philippines, Singapore, we are all Southeast Asian countries. We probably call ourselves Southeast Asians because we have very unique culture to begin with.
Right. And very cosmopolitan. I mean, I would do the same in the sense of, if there are folks coming from the outside, I'll show our Hispanic side. Eat adobo, caldereta, menudo, and then you can also eat the other things that you know about Filipino food, just to showcase you to our cosmopolitanism. thank you for bringing
Yeah.
us to that topic, because I think one of the misconceptions about Singapore is that because you're ethnic Chinese or Chinese speaking
Mm,
majority city state, there's this preconception that there is almost a continuum
mm,
with motherland China, or at least that's what motherland China wants to put it. Our good friend Ambassador Kausikan Bilahari has been very clear about
mm,
threat from United Front, among others, throughout the
mm.
years.
Yeah.
And I see you getting
Mm,
trolled a lot online. By the way, as we speak, there are people there saying we're so glad to hear you because they follow you on Twitter. They call it X, by the way, but it's Twitter. Can you tell me a little about it? Because I see people from China. Obviously, these are trolls. I'm not sure they attack you. You're a traitor to to your roots and all of that. Can you tell me how is being? I mean, you're really a patriotic Singaporean, and I find that very such a revelation, and I love it, and I really respect you for that, my friend. Can you tell me
thank you.
about what does it mean to be a Singaporean of a Chinese descent, and how is that different? Again, I'm sorry, this sounds stupid, but there's just so much nonsense out there that I just want to shut that down. Can you tell me how being a person of Chinese descent but Singaporean, how is that different from what we're hearing from the other side? Yeah.
Mm. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to really, sort of set the record straight. And I'll be very quick about it, so that we don't, sort of hop other topics. But it is a very passionate issue that sometimes I share with my friends from abroad
Yeah.
because they ask about, how do you feel like being an ethnic Chinese? I like to call myself, and I still follow what I'm taught in school. Right way from the very beginning when I was still a very young boy, that we call ourselves Singaporean Chinese,
Yeah.
not Chinese Singaporean.
Right. Right.
Back then I might not have really understood why my teachers would insist on
Yeah.
the
That.
sequencing,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But now I understand that you have to first emphasize the fact that you are Singaporean and not a Chinese first, because that's how we try to build a national identity. The teachers told the same thing to ethnic Indians, ethnic Malays, for example. You are a Singaporean Indian, you are a Singaporean Malay, for example. You are Singaporean Eurasian, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is how it goes. Importantly, you are Singapore. In our case, of course, similarly for those who have, their ancestry from India or from Indonesia or Malaysia, for example, it's the same. But I will have to say, given that we are 70% ethnic Chinese, it tends to give people impression that we are a Chinese nation.
Hmm.
I spoke to a number of Chinese scholars and some Chinese officials. They appreciate that, we are not a Chinese nation, but they
Right.
do caution me that, Colin, while we may understand, it's only because we are in the field, we understand, we read a lot.
Right. Weird.
But in the mainstream, most of the PRC Chinese, they don't understand, because to them, Singapore is predominantly Chinese, so it should be Chinese. So therefore, so you can try to convince them, you can try to shape them. It's not always easy. Now, and there is, to me, what I observe to be a very clear bifurcation between what I see as PRC mainlanders who live in the north of the Yangtze River and those who live in the south of the Yangtze River.
Right.
Look, my ancestry came from the south of the Yangtze River in Fujian. And if you go to Fujian, you go to Shanghai, for example, you'll find that they are quite similar to ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia in the way they talk. But the further north you go up, say Beijing, you start to see that the accent is very different. Even the diet is
Absolutely, yeah.
different. Look, those in the north, they eat buns, they eat noodles, but those in the south, they eat rice. They are like Southeast Asians. So
Absolutely.
if you try to convince those who live, say, along the southern coastal provinces of China, probably they will have a better appreciation of Southeast Asia. But if you try to talk to people in Beijing, for example, they don't understand. To them, it's like, no, you are Chinese because everyone talks Chinese, right? So and you
Yeah.
have your ancestors who come from China, so you should be Chinese. So get that question. And again, you rightly point out that I got trolled every now and then. I mean, I receive my fair share of
I see
bashing
that, my friend. Yeah.
yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for raising that. there are those who say, you should be, your grandfather will be ashamed of you. You are a traitor to your Chinese ancestry, whatever. They use all sorts of languages. I was somewhat affected initially, but I came to realize that, there's nothing else to attack me. I mean, if you have facts and actual content to debate with me about, you wouldn't have gone to the extent of attacking my ancestry, right? And I tried to make a joke out of it. So I remember I replied one of those comments to say, "Oh, you saw my grandfather?
Right.
My grandfather passed away during the Civil War. If you see him, please send my regards to him then." Like, seriously, why bring my grandfather inside? He passed away so long ago.
Exactly.
Right? And I even had to say, if my grandfather is still alive today, maybe he will understand what I'm doing. Because
exactly.
all I know is, for me as a Singaporean who is educated in the system, all I know and what I identify is that there is a difference between your nationality and your ethnicity. Nationality and ethnicity cannot be conflated together, right? You could do that in the case of China, for example, right? You can call yourself Chinese and you're from China. But in our case, we're Singapore as a nation, but I'm anti-Chinese. And I'm trying to draw that balance because in a way I have relatives in China.
Right.
Because I know that there are people online who accuse me of hating China. No, I don't hate China because I have distant relatives in China. And let me share with you this snippet that I seldom share with anyone. My grandfather returned to China at the height of the Civil War in China, which is strange because everyone is trying to get out. He's trying to get in because he needs home. He went back to Fujian because he wanted to die there, right? He went there, he passed away in the hometown, and because of the Cultural Revolution and all that. So eventually, news did not reach us until we actually get the letter from our relatives in Fujian many months after his death. They were the ones who carted the coffin all the way up to the mountain to bury him. So let me ask you, why would I hate my relatives, right?
Yeah.
They're Chinese. They're still Chinese. They're patriotic Chinese.
Yeah.
They will swear by the red and the yellow star flag, for example, but I swear by my flag, but I'm still grateful to them. That is the cultural affinity. I still go back before to visit my the grave of my grandfather as well. So why should I hate China? I mean, I question and I do really criticize the policies coming out from the CCP government.
You mean the United Front really policy of just blurring the lines of anyone from an ethnic Chinese or Chinese speaking background? Oh, we're all part of one. So in that sense, they're putting all folks of Chinese background in a very perilous position. I mean, in the Philippines, the problem is my fear is xenophobia, or whenever we criticize China, because I'm not Chinese, they attack me as xenophobic. In your case, they'll say you're like a self-hating Chinese. Essentially, that's what they're trying to do, right? Can you tell me, again, for people who don't, Dr. Colin Ko, sorry, I just have to be formal so that people know they're catching up here. You have a Singaporean Chinese Cultural Center, a gorgeous one, beautiful, very expensive, last time I checked, but for good reason. Why was that established? Was that to make clear to the world that Singaporean Chinese is Singaporean before it's Chinese? To separate it from I think there's a Chinese Cultural Center also there in Singapore, right? By PRC China. Can you explain a little bit of that to us?
Yeah. In fact, this is one of those so-called heritage centers that were built alongside a good number of associated heritage centers as well. For example, one of Peranakan culture as well. If you go to the Asian Civilization Museum, you'll have a pretty good collection that sort of display Singapore's heritage as well. So now, the thing is, as you know, in Singapore, we have a number of Chinese clan associations.
Right.
The Fujian Clan Association, the
Cantonese
Clan Association, the Hakkanese Clan Associations, and all that, and the Teochew Clan Associations. I mean, the thing is that all these were legacy of the past because our forefathers, when they came to Singapore, they couldn't speak English.
Yeah.
Probably they couldn't speak Chinese as well. They probably could only speak their dialect.
Right.
And that was all about it. So it was largely meant to preserve a part of the culture itself. It wasn't meant to sort of propagate that, oh, we are a Chinese nation or whatsoever. So even when we are trying to propagate the fact that ethnic Chinese were part of Singapore, but we also want to highlight that even within ethnic Chinese community, there are different dialect groups that will exist. And, somehow we coexisted peacefully side by side, right? We share different culture. I mean, Teochew cuisine and Cantonese cuisine and Fujian cuisine, they are very different, right? There are some commonalities,
Absolutely,
but
yeah,
the way it was
absolutely,
cooked
yes.
is very, very different. So
Yeah.
we are trying to accentuate the fact that we are melting pot extension. We have many influencers from all over places. So I think that was what I believe why in the context why that center was being set up. It was meant to highlight that it is not meant to be a Chinese center. It's a uniquely local Chinese heritage center to begin with.
I really appreciate your passion and all, and I knew this was gonna come out, and I felt this is the conversation we should have in our part of the world, because there's a lot of gaslighting going on there. There's a lot of blurring of the lines that it's very unfair that is going on. I feel for my Chinoy also brothers and sisters who are being put under pressure because by when mainland China United Front tries to tell they're essentially part of motherland China, they put them in a very difficult position also, and I also feel for them, and that's also the spirit within which I'm having this conversation with you.
Yeah.
Colin, let's talk about this. When it comes to Singapore, you are appreciated. So we're transitioning a bit to strategy. I'm sure we can have more conversation. I want to come back to you more on this in the future.
No problem.
When it comes to Singapore, there's this debate about whether Singapore is a kind of a gold standard for hedging. Some would say more critically that what Singapore is engaging in is performative hedging. Or something, actually, some will say it in a complementary way that you are in a performative hedging. Like, for instance, for every MOA with the US, there's an MOU with China, but the quality and substance of the one with one side is almost incomparable. But in terms of optics, it creates this notion of equibalancing, when in fact it's very asymmetrical, which is what we see with hedging. And more importantly, very dynamic. Very, very dynamic. So when I follow Balakrishnan, when I follow your leaders throughout the past 3 years alone, I see a tremendous amount of it's like a stock market, right? But the end goal is preservation of your national interest and strategic autonomy. Can you tell us a little bit about this Singaporean art of hedging? To the degree that it dispels this idea, oh, Singapore is really pro China, but pretending, or the other way, that Singapore is actually a friend, an ally that pretends not to just be a friend of US, but in fact they're. But how is Singapore handling this, and what are the new pressures and challenges for Singapore? Because you can be brilliant for the past 50 years, but new challenges are going to come up.
Yeah. Wow. We are of course described by some to have been practicing what they call equidistant foreign policy pertaining to China, to the US. Not really equidistant. I mean, I think to some it might be what I see as a very simplistic kind of characterization, right? Because as you rightly pointed out, yeah, for every MOU we sign with the US, we will sign one with China. But the quality is very different, right? The quality of the type of cooperation, it differs from one to the other. Now, give you an example. And this is something that I got as an anecdote from more than one source. Look, China loves to sign MOUs with various countries. They love the optics of being seen to be signing MOU. The big banner behind, and then the grandeur of signing an MOU and then shaking hands. They have the photo of course, all good. Then the question is, after signing an MOU, the follow up isn't always a follow up. If there's any follow up at all, then we will be lucky that they will follow.
So
through.
they're also
Whatever is the-
performative. So it's also
Yeah.
them. They're also performative. Yeah.
Exactly, you're right. I mean, you picked up. So for China, it
Good
does
point, yeah.
appear that much of it they love and they seem to emphasize more on the performative part. For example, look, both of us look at South China Sea. You remember some years ago when China talked about the early harvest cooperative initiative, and they come with a laundry list of all these initiatives in point forms. All those sound very good, but again, it is performative to me because I wonder whether they paid true attention to whether any of these initiatives could actually work. right?
Yeah,
So they love
absolutely.
the idea of putting out proposals. I mean, look at what the Chinese leaders have been doing these days. They love to propose 4 points, 5 points, and whatever points. And the thing is that all these are very general, very generic issues that they raise, but there is no meat at all. There's no
Yeah.
substance at
More
all.
sizzle than
So
steak. More sizzle than steak.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
more, yeah, exactly. So to me, that largely characterize the way China approaches signing on to MOUs and all that. You do question whether they are always very serious in trying to follow up on things anyway. So on that, yeah, you see, look, we try to maintain close ties with both, right? But again, as you rightly pointed out, the texture of those
Yeah,
relationships
it's
differs
yeah,
a lot.
yeah,
For
exactly.
example, we love to sometimes, and again, is in fact a very misleading kind of narrative that some of the scholars are trying to put forward is that, oh, we are closer to China economically and we are closer to the US
So
in
yeah,
security realm. I
that kind of
mean,
artificial
very
division,
lazy.
right? It's an artificial
Yeah,
division. Yeah,
it is artificial. This bifurcation is artificial because, look, the US is in fact one of the biggest investors in Singapore. In
hundred
fact, South Africa
percent,
is the biggest investor
100%. Yeah,
throughout Southeast Asia. This might be changing, but most of the US investments are found in Singapore,
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
Southeast Asia. That's why whenever our American friends hear this narrative that, oh, we are closer to China economy, they jump. They're like, what are you talking about? We had the greatest investor in Southeast Asia in your country, and to say that
absolutely.
you're closer to China. I was like, okay, I mean, maybe that deliberate bifurcation is largely aimed to be performative as well, right?
Exactly. I mean,
You know,
that's what I'm saying.
right?
That's not everyone is. This is a kabuki show. I mean, this is people do not understand. So, you also
Yeah,
know where I'm coming from, right? I'm talking about
yeah,
pro Duterte people. Those types of people who take the headlines and all and try to make stories out of it to push for an agenda of essentially submission to China. So I said I want to
yeah.
bring in a legit Singaporean patriotic friend of mine who can just completely demolish this nonsense about, oh, you see, Singapore is saying all these nice things about China, we should be also like them. And well, first of all, Singapore doesn't have territorial disputes with China the way we have, right? And you're not the US treaty
Yeah,
ally. But I want to say
yeah.
another thing. You're absolutely right. I think the US FDI stock in your country is what, in excess of $300 billion. I've
Yeah.
even seen bigger numbers. But also your military equipment. I mean, you have F-35 fighters. I think the B variant, which can go vertically. So you have the best state of the art American weapon systems by far. I even heard my Japanese friends from Japan Self Defense Forces saying, "My goodness, Singapore is okay, maybe you disagree, but for them, you guys are so good that you may give even the Japanese some sort of a good challenge or run for their money." Can you also enlighten our friends about that? Because here in the Philippines, my
Mm,
contention here is the problem in the Philippine-US alliance is both sides took each other for granted. In a sense that the Americans
mm,
always had more important countries to deal with, including your country, for good reasons. And on our part, I don't think we leveraged that alliance properly. And our strategic elite were nowhere as, I won't use the word patriotic, but let's say anticipatory or let's say forward-looking as yours. We're kind of fixing that. So you have a weird situation where U.S. is a treaty ally of Philippines, they're not your treaty ally, but the weapon systems you have is way more sophisticated than anything we observe. And again, just to push back against people who say, but Singapore is a wealthy country, Philippines, blah, blah. Well, Jordan and Pakistan have more advanced American weapon systems than the Philippines. So I just want to look at that in terms of your security cooperation with the US.
mm,
What are the misconceptions and what is the reality? What is your theory of the case?
yeah. Thanks so much. Okay, to build on that, the context is that Singapore is able to survive with our foreign policy to this day because we have been very consistent
Yeah.
in what we're doing. We're consistent with what we are saying, and in a way, it helps to sort of pave the way to put forth our position very clearly that we are not pro anyone, we're just pro national interest. I mean, in some cases we cooperate with you, in some cases we cooperate with them. For example, we could align with China, say, on the issue about protectionism in trade,
Sure.
multilateralism in trade. We could
During
align
Trump,
with China
during
on
Trump,
that.
during
Right?
Trump, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
one hundred
yeah,
percent. Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
right? And of course, on the security front, we will harp on the international rule of law. For example, we don't openly criticize China, but we sort of like that this is important. So we are very clear what we are talking about. We stress principles and interests. I mean, these to me are the two keywords: principles, interests, and
Absolutely.
not about ideology, not about because I'm friend with these guys, so I have to side with this guy on everything. The thing is that nation states, independent nation states, as small as Singapore, for example, we have agency, right? We have the
Absolutely.
agency to make our own autonomous decisions based on our best national interests. Um, Everyone could be telling us what to do, right? I mean, we could have Americans to tell us, oh, you should do this, you should do that. But we also have equally from China, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. End of the day, we take in all these suggestions and we make our best executive decision on what is best to our national interest. So on that front, I have to say, Richard, your country, because the Philippines has an abiding, long-standing treaty alliance with the U.S. So in a way, it creates a lot more complexities for you
Exactly.
because
So we cannot photocopy or replicate you directly. It's a very
yeah,
more
yeah,
complex picture.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for us, I mean, people describe our relationship with the US as anything but an alliance in name. But the thing is
A
that,
friend that acts like an ally or something like that. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
something like that. But you see, we understand that if you are a treaty ally, it comes along with the traditional obligations
Yeah.
for collective defense,
Right.
right? And sometimes you may be compelled to do things you may not want to do. You may not be forced by the other party to do what you want to do, but there will be consequences, right, that you may have to entertain. So that limits your room of maneuver. So being an ally of someone is not always an easy life. But again, I know some country wanted to sort of propagate the fact that because you're an ally, you're a vassal of someone, and all that. Look, it doesn't mean because you're an ally means you're a vassal of somebody, right? I mean, you're an ally because there's a collective defense treaty, but it doesn't mean you make decisions on all front based on the interests of that ally. I mean, that
Right.
is a misconception. In our case, we have no such thing. So in a way, we could argue very safely that we're not a treaty ally of anyone. So we could safely tell everyone, and with a very, not even a slim of doubt that we don't take orders from anyone because in a way we are free to make our own decisions. We can say that because we have no alliance. In the Philippines case, I mean, somehow, unfortunately, that had become a situation that people use that as a narrative to attack the Philippines
Yeah.
and undermining Philippines sovereignty, undermining Philippines autonomy, which to me is a very, very unfortunate. But at the same time, one will argue, then why not just annul your alliance with the US? But look, is it so easy to just simply annul alliance like that? I mean, look, it is still difficult in the case of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact to dissolve. It dissolved because the USSR dissolved, right? But outside that, have you seen NATO dissolve? No. Okay, it's not an alliance, it's a partnership. FPDA is a Cold War relic, some argue, but it never dissolved because it has to reinvent itself. Once you get something institutionalized, you will tend to see the benefits of that institutionalized relationship, right? You draw training opportunities, equipment opportunities, doctrinal opportunities, and of course, it is an insurance, right? In the Philippines case, you rightly mentioned that, in terms of the military capability is still behind some of our regional countries. But that is where the alliance is important. It's a
Yeah.
backstop for security. I mean, this has to be understood. In our case, look, we have consistently spent on defense, for sure. Of course, some will argue, Colin, because you're a rich country, right? So you can spend as much. But I think it's not so much about we being rich and we spend a lot. What's important is what I see as a long-term planning approach to that.
Yeah.
Your ability to plan long-term because equipment get obsolete pretty fast. You have to plan for it to either be retired or you modernize it to extend its life. So you have to plan it in such a way that it segues well with each other. So you don't leave any gaps in between. And of course, throughout the entire process, you build your capability in terms of your technical competency in operating increasingly more sophisticated equipment. Now, one thing to note, which of course is different in the case of the AFPE, right? is that largely the Singapore Armed Forces is a conscript-based armed forces. So because we are, the
Oops. One
recording
second.
stopped
Yeah, yeah.
actually.
Sorry,
So
I think I need to delete some. Sorry about that. Hmm. This should take care of it. Okay. One second. Sorry about that. I think apparently I filled up. So I'll
hello.
connect this to the other one. Don't worry. Just a second. I just have to delete this once and we should have space. Okay. Okay. So we'll just continue it on this one. I'll just put them together. Mm. Sorry about that, Connie. One second. I just have to. Huh. What happened here? Lesson learned. I had to delete some stuff. Apparently, this laptop is completely full with everything I've been doing. I just have to delete some stuff here so we can have. So we're gonna have everything that we discussed a while ago. I just wanna. This part is very very important. Because we're going to the last part. But I wanted to a little bit help us with the one second. Oh, sorry. Just a second. I think things got full. I'm just so everything we said is recorded. I'm just
Ah,
gonna make a little bit space and then put them together. So don't worry, nothing is
ah,
lost. I just have to
okay,
take out
okay.
some stuff so that we have more space. Apologies again. Apparently
Hey, no
that
problem,
happens
no
with
problem.
so much doing a lot and not cleaning things up right away.
No worries
My
at all.
apologies for
Yeah.
that one second. But everything I've said
Hey,
is there anyway. I'm just gonna retrieve
yeah.
them and glad that we have a backup here in terms of audio and also we'll make sure
No worries.
nothing is
Yeah,
lost.
yeah. Mm,
Lesson learned. I should have double checked again this
mm.
space. Let's hope this will work now. Hmm. I should take because I want to just go to the last part when I want to ask you about what the Philippines should do and why do you think China is treating the
Mm,
Philippines in the way it is doing. Just need
mm,
to delete some of this stuff there. Apologies
mm,
again.
mm, mm, mm,
Otherwise I have to use my other laptop just for the last part. Um,
mm.
huh. That should take care of it. How come? Okay. Okay, it looks like I may need to reset this one because it's not acknowledging my free space. I actually freed lots of space.
Mm.
So maybe I have to send you again on a and then I'll put them together. My apologies for that.
No problem.
Okay, I'll
No,
send you a link
no.
again now, and it will just need around 15 minutes or so. I know we're also a little bit over time, but thank you so much, Colin. My apologies. I'll get back to you very shortly. Let me just
No
resend you a new.
problem.
I'll send you now.
Okay. I'll catch you soon, okay? Yeah.
Fantastic. Talk to you soon. Huh. Ay, ay, ay. Nangyari na naman to. Oh, sorry guys, nag-overflow na naman tong laptop na to. Ay, ay, ay. Let me use my other laptop. One second, guys. Sorry. Apologies, guys. One second. Huh. Ay, ay, yan kasi walang production kaya pumapalpak na naman. Ah, do this again. Sorry about that, guys. Ano naman yan? Bakit wala? Sorry, guys. Ugh. Huh. Yeah, my apologies for that. Let's get the ball rolling right away.
Hey, no
My
problem, no problem.
apologies.
Thanks so much. Yeah,
Of,
no worries.
of course, fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, we're back again. Sorry, apologies for the technical problem. We're with Dr. Colin Cole from Rajaram School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. So Colin, we were talking about how Singapore preserves its strategic autonomy in an increasingly difficult environment. So can you
Mm.
remind us again about what is your defense strategy? Most recently, you got a German submarine, you have F-35
Mm.
fighters, but you were telling me that it's not just about being a rich country, it's about being anticipatory, it's about making sure that you can be as self-reliant as possible, and what could be the lessons or not lessons for countries like the Philippines who are already a US treaty ally.
Yeah. So, of course, for Singapore, given that we are not a treaty ally of anyone, we are free to choose where we could buy our equipment. We, of course, were trying to get the best. As far as we could afford, we will try to get the best. And of course, very often it isn't necessarily always the case that you want the best, but you'll get it given
Yeah.
that could be political constraints and whatnot. We are lucky because we are a close security partner to the US, and that sort of accorded us access to some of the latest technologies. We are able to get training in the US, for example, and to really get up close to how the US carry out joint war fighting. We sort of learn best practices from them, of course, participating in various joint exercises. All these are good. In the case of the Philippines, given that you are a U.S. treaty ally, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are beholden to buy equipment from only one party. Of
Right.
course, the U.S. will keep pressing you to buy American, right? Because they'll say that we are allies and we should build greater interoperability and greater commonality. But again, what I saw in the recent times is how the AFP has tried to diversify beyond the US,
Yeah.
getting a European kit, Israeli kit, for example,
Indian.
which I thought, yeah, indeed. Even for Japan, for example, right? So it is very important to note that getting a diversity of sources gives you much more political freedom, and of course it gives you more autonomy. It also accentuates your autonomy, therefore. So I think generally that direction that the Philippines is taking is correct.
Right.
But of course, in our case, we are very different from the Philippines. That's why I wouldn't go to the extent to say that our defense strategy or policy is necessarily replicable in the case of the Philippines, because the Philippines is a much larger country than Singapore. You have multiple sea fronts that you have to deal with. You have many seaboards, right? To the north, there is always the Taiwan flashpoint, and of course, to the west there is the South China Sea. And these days, you are finding the Chinese increasingly more active to the eastern seaboard as well. And of course, the south, you have the case of the Sulu Sea issue, for example. And within the Philippines, you have both internal and external security challenges that you have to deal with. Singapore is a small country. We have a very limited geography to begin with. So one will argue that we are a little bit lucky, because if you try to compare military power in terms of how you balance between capability and the geographical scope, I think we are running a surplus on that. Some will argue that, look, Singapore, you have probably as many warships as, say, some of your larger, Southeast Asian neighbors, which
Indonesia.
are much bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, Indonesia, for example, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The last I saw was that, in terms of the number of ships, we are almost close to say some of our regional countries. But if you go down into it, they have a much bigger maritime zone they have to deal with, or rather a much bigger security zone they have to deal with. So in our case, we are lucky that we don't have that much geographically that we have to protect. But again, we do see our security as more than just bounded by geography. Because, for example, our stakes far out in the distant areas, like say in the Middle East, is well known because our energy security is largely dependent on that as well.
Right.
So one of the reasons why we send warships to the counter-piracy missions in, I think, from 2008 onwards is a very good reminder that we don't see security as largely just around the region. But suffice it to say is that primarily, I believe this is the case of Philippines as well. Primarily, our priority is to defend the homeland, right? And then international security is secondary, is like co-curricular activities that we will deal with. But again, we are small, but at the same time, we are aware that given that we are small, we have very limited strategic depth. So we will have to carry out what people will deem to call a forward defense strategy. Right? A forward defense strategy to some is offensive. But again, we try to undertake the task of reminding and assuring our neighbors that we may have a forward defense strategy, but it is in large part because of our geostrategic condition. We have no strategic depth.
You have no cushion. Yeah, you have no cushion.
Yeah, we have no cushion. We have no hinterland. I mean, look, in the case of the Soviet Union, when it was attacked by Nazi Germany back then, it could trade space for time, right? From west to east. And it could buy enough time to launch a counterattack. We had no such luxury at all. So if we have to fight, and of course our first priority is to deter and to have diplomacy, but if we ever have to fight, then we have to be decisive enough to win. And that, of course, is a very tall order. I mean, it is in the mission statement of the SAF, but again, fighting the war itself isn't always straightforward. Look at the case of Ukraine, right? Russia thought it could sort of walk over it in 72 hours, but sorry, yes, it is still running now after 2 years. So again, it's very uncertain. But we try to put in as much insurance in that. First, by ensuring that we have a good long-term defense planning approach. We try to get some of the most high-tech as best as possible. And we don't just do that. I mean, those that we can develop and manufacture in Singapore, we will do that as well to give us more insurance. We try to maintain good ties with like-minded countries which are interested in upholding regional security. We work with Philippines, we work with other Southeast Asian countries, we work with extra-regional powers like the US to try to bring everyone on board. So that's part of the defense diplomacy of the game, right? And of course, you know that we have a small population and we have a shrinking population. So we do face a long-term manpower issue. So we move towards greater automation, and we try to create more force multiplier effect on what we acquire. So, and I did mention that we are a largely conscript-based armed forces. We have a core group of regulars or professional military personnel, but the bulk of the fighting force was made up by conscripts like myself back then. I was completely demobilized back in 2015, but prior to that, I have to go for my in-camp training every year for the next 10 years after my active service. So that is a core group. But you see, that also means that Singapore doesn't have to pay that much on manpower.
Because you're well trained already, yeah.
I mean, the thing is that because we are conscripts, so conscripts don't get paid a full-time salary, right? So when it comes to manpower costs, you save quite a lot. And that manpower cost saving, you translate that into equipment purchases and other capability enhancement. But in the case of the Philippines, you have no conscription. You have ROTC, right? But you have no conscription. So it means that for fully professional armed forces, you do have to spend quite a bit on manpower. And of course, you do have to spend on modernization. So I don't envy the Philippines because you have so many things you have to deal with. Multiple security issues that you have to contend with, manpower costs that you cannot do without, and of course, equipment modernization imperative as well. Given that much of equipment has reached block of obsolescence and you need to replace them quickly and in numbers that is appreciable enough to give you operational effect. So on our end, what I could suggest, I mean, I don't want to say advice because advice is a very strong word. So what I could suggest from the Singapore perspective is that it's important to think long term. Once you think long term and ensure that when you budget for the long term is consistent, I think in time to come, you will see the benefits from that. You start to see results. So what I see today, because I'm a keen watcher of the AFP, I'm very impressed by what we have seen over the past 10 years or so.
Yeah.
The gradual transformation. I use the Philippines as a case study for my class. I showed three pictures. One is a picture of the Philippine Navy back in 2010 exercising the US using World War II vintage equipment.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then the next picture I showed was a more recent exercise in 2018 with the US Navy, this time around with a newer kit, the
Yeah.
Hamilton class formerly from the US Coast Guard, but it's better, right?
Yeah.
It improved. And the last picture I showed was a full-fledged frigate that came from South Korea
Right.
and that fired missile. So I told my class that look at how the Philippine Navy has evolved. And with that, the Philippine Air Force, the Philippine Marine Corps, the Philippine Army, for example, how it evolved over time. Now infusing a much better equipment and of course training with more partners and gaining more experience and more exposure. So we are seeing what as an outsider, what I see as the fruit of what is done right. Since the time of the Aquino administration till now. I mean, to Duterte's credit, at least he did not disrupt the AFP modernization, right?
To the
he
credit of
carried
his
on.
defense minister and officials, I'm not sure to the
Yeah.
credit.
I mean,
that's
probably
the
he has-
trick. Yeah.
Probably he has to acquiesce to that. After all, he could say no, right? So, end of the day, I think, while the Secretary of National Defense has a big part to play in that, but I guess Duterte, to his credit, I think he did not try to actively disrupt the
Yeah.
whole process, which is a good thing. Because if you think about that, back then, during the time when Fidel Ramos was president, and then you go on to the time of Arroyo and the time of Estrada, it has always been a stillborn when it comes to AFP modernization because the argument is that we have internal security, so we don't
Yeah.
we cannot really focus on external. So that goes AFP modernization. But since Aquino all the way till now, I think
Yeah.
what we saw was a very consistent direction that was being undertaken, and now under the current administration, I think the direction is all the more clear. But my question, of course, is after Marcos Jr., right? The next new president, will he carry on or will she carry on the next step forward? So if there is a sort of a future-proofing kind of effort
Yeah.
undertaken now, it should be undertaken. The future-proofing of defense policy planning that is completely immune to the change of administration. It ensures consistency because the defense game is one thing about long term, right?
Yeah.
You cannot just simply spend now and then you sort of don't spend after that, and then you sort of neglect the whole process.
Follow
So
through.
that will be my suggestion.
Yeah. Just last point on this. I completely agree with you. Where I'm cautiously optimistic is the fact that we saw from Aquino, the revised AFP modernization, Horizon 1, Horizon 2. We're a bit behind the curve, obviously, but now we want to push the Horizon 3 to a kind of a $36 billion 10-year program of modernization. You can see that it's increasingly become bipartisan, if I can put it that way. So even if Sara Duterte were to become the president, I think she would have a hard time disrupting this without creating unnecessary problems for herself, to put it nicely.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
it's also about strategic culture. I talked to a lot of senior officials in this administration, including those who serve under Duterte, who seem to have a very mature and increasingly elegant understanding of things. And I think, finally, I think all of my shouting is working in a sense that the term middle power is increasingly being used by officials, no longer small power. I said, we're a huge country with the same population as Mexico. We're definitely not small, right? No, but you have
Yeah.
to up the game. But last point, Dr. Colin Cole, again, for those who are joining us now, why do you think China is so aggressive towards the Philippines? And why do you think about the argument that let's just give up on the U.S. alliance and everything will be nice with China, as if the Duterte 6 years didn't happen? But what is your advice? Why do you think China is so aggressive to the Philippines? And do you think, sorry, this is a conversation after all also, do you think
Yeah.
this is also about Philippines holding the line for a while, getting China's grudging respect, and then we can negotiate friendship from a position of better equilibrium, in the sense that China is also mistreating the Philippines because we had 6 years of Duterte, because they don't respect the Philippines, because they have contempt for us, because they think we're weak. And so we have to be plucky for a while until we can negotiate with them on better terms. Oh, what do you think also about that argument, which is essentially my argument? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, if you trace back into the longer history of the South China Sea dispute, you'll find that ever since the Chinese fought a shooting war with the Vietnamese
Vietnamese,
back
yeah.
in 1988, it has not fought a shooting war with anyone.
Exactly. Exactly.
However, the next victim that it was consistently targeting has been the Philippines. Mischief Reef, I think, is the very first beginning because every time, whenever I talk about the South China Sea dispute between the Philippines and China, I remind my class and anyone that I spoke to that you look all the way back. I mean, the recent tensions do not just happen under the current administration or even
Absolutely.
during the Duterte administration or even during the Aquino administration. All of these came about right in the 1990s, especially. I mean, Mischief Reef, then came Scarborough Shoal, and then Whitsun Reef that was right under Duterte, just 1 year or so before he stepped down, right? And then now what we saw in the case of the second Thomas Shoal, Scarborough Shoal, Sabina Shoal, for example, all this has a long way to go. Now, if I could put forth a few factors why China particularly seemed to like to poke the Philippines, right? One is that, of course, the Philippines was considered a weaker rival,
Yeah.
right? The Philippines was distracted by its internal problems and had no attention given to external security issues.
Yeah.
So when you have a country that is so preoccupied with internal problems, it created an opening, right?
Yeah.
And that is, of course, something in sharp contrast to the case of Vietnam, for example. I mean, Vietnam smarted from the 1988 clash with China. Of course, China always remembered that it fought a very difficult border war with Vietnam, and it knew that Vietnam, because they are both communist nations, right? And China has witnessed upfront how Vietnam is so united as a nation against foreign aggression. So it wouldn't want to touch Vietnam. I mean, it has grudging respect for Vietnam because of that. But in the South China Sea, Malaysia and Indonesia is not a disputant, but it is considered a party to the South China Sea. But both Indonesia and Malaysia, they don't tend to put a lot of emphasis on that anyway. And of course, the issue here has more to do with jurisdiction more than territorial issue itself. However, with the Philippines, that is a key issue for China. One is that if you put aside Vietnam, the Philippines is the next in line when it comes to the extent of territorial claims in the South China Sea vis-a-vis China. So that is, I think, the second reason why it will want to touch the Philippines. Thirdly, is that geostrategically, the Philippines is a gateway to the open Pacific Ocean, right? If you put aside Taiwan, I mean, to China, the Taiwan is always a long-term issue. But before that, you still need to gain access. You need to break out into the Pacific Ocean. And the weakest link in the first island chain, apparently, is the Philippines. So that actually, I believe, what sort of explains that. Fourthly, and I think this is a theory that I wanted to discuss with you because I want to test that theory, is that if China's aim is to undermine US alliances and partnerships and to cast aspersions around the world and not just in the region that the US is a fickle and untrustworthy ally to anyone and therefore not worthy of any world leadership as a superpower, then what you need to do is to undermine it through its ally. That you show that the US has no way to protect its ally. China has been having a few days of propaganda when it comes to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, and they use that as a way to remind Taiwan that look at Afghanistan, the US isn't going to come to you. Then they'll say the same thing to the Philippines that look at Afghanistan, the US isn't going to come to you, it isn't going to help you. But if China is able to undermine the Philippines, despite the fact that the Philippines is a US treaty ally, it goes to show and sort of amplifies the narrative that the US isn't a trustworthy ally or partner to begin with, and all the more it has no right to exercise the world leadership. So that's the way I see it. It's an indirect way that China is using to attack the US as well. And somehow the Philippines has become, sandwiched in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely see your point in terms of China has every incentive to press the Philippines because of its relatively limited capacity to fight back But at the same time, because there's a US element, it also has an incentive to show the positive of that alliance. Therefore, there's more pressure also for the United States to be much more reassuring towards the Philippines, which is a completely different conversation we can have separately. I would say, of course, one reason I also feel China is really mistreating the Philippines is because they have not come to terms with the fact that Dutertes are no longer in position of power. And
Yeah.
I think they drank the Kool-Aid, meaning their proxies in the Philippines made them think that Duterte's will be power and forever, and essentially the Philippines will be another Cambodia. We got Hun Sen, everything else
Yeah.
will follow. So complete misreading of Philippine domestic politics,
Yeah.
civil military relations, and not reading enough of Richard Hidarian. But lastly, I would also add Taiwan. I think they're really worried about Taiwan because the Philippines may allow Americans to put as many HIMARS and Typhoon and whatever, and that will have implications for war in Taiwan. Because if Americans
Yeah.
have good missile defense systems, then they can have a counter also to China's anti-cruise ballistic missile, layers and layers of that also in their provinces. So in short, the Philippines has a very unique geography and set
Yeah.
of geopolitical alignments and assets and liabilities. Therefore, this is where I think the point comes in that not only with Singapore, but I think with Malaysia and Vietnam also, there are really not much direct lessons we can draw from them. And that's why the debate is really, for me, very ideological. People who hate US in the Philippines will say, oh, let's be like Vietnam. But good luck, because, it took Vietnam, I don't know, 100 years of wars to
Yeah.
become what they are today. Some would say 1,000 years of struggle against
Yeah.
China. The moment we give
Yeah.
up the alliance with the US, good luck with China, right? We
Yeah.
saw they have no
Yeah.
respect for a country that has no backup. And for all the shortcomings of the US, right, Colin, they're still at the gray zone level. I think if there's no
Yeah.
US element, I think they will breach the gray zone level because there's nothing else that will stop them. So I think what I really appreciate about this conversation is it's really real talk. We are fellow Southeast Asian countries, but
Yeah.
let's be honest, we're also extremely, extremely diverse. And I would even say Philippines is almost exceptional in terms of challenges and also opportunities it faces in this part of the world. Colin, any final rejoinder or something that because I know we have gone way over time, but you realize
No,
we
not at
have to
all.
have more of this in the future as we discuss developments in the region and of course U.S. elections also later on.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to say, and mindful that some of our readers, listeners, might come from China, for example. Let me just say something. If you are confronting a democratic country, and it is not just one person who is running the show.
Sure.
I mean, look, during the 6 years of Duterte, and Richard, bro, please correct me. I know Duterte was put as a very popular, president, right? He was deemed to have done well. He has high public approval ratings on things like, say, how he handled the pandemic, how he was able to carry out his duties as a president. But I do know that there's one thing he scored very lowly over the 6 years was how he dealt with China and the South China Sea policy. I mean, all this consistently scored lowly. If Duterte's aim was to try to shape Philippine opinion in favor of China, he actually achieved the opposite. I mean, the perception actually worsened over the years. So my puzzle is that if China, and with that particular reference to the Chinese embassy in Manila, I mean, you are an embassy in Manila, you're supposed to go and reach out to the wider public and get a sense of what's going on instead of reaching out to your comfort zone, right? That, those who are pro-China and you listen only to them and you neglect the fact that over the 6 years, the posts are there so publicly for you to see that the general public isn't happy with you. And they are not happy with the way you dealt with the South China Sea issue. And you should have done something to correct that. So if China had the impression that they were welcome and whatever they are doing were approved by the Philippines, that is misleading, right? Maybe it's approved by Duterte, but it's not approved by the Philippines as a country itself and as a society. And they should know that as a democratic country, the Philippines undergo elections. Duterte cannot run a second term, right, after 6 years. So it could be a different president, and China has to be prepared for that. So I think for China, it is a grave misreading of the Philippines as a society. I would say that in some way, it also reflects the general outlook they have towards other alien societies. They tend to see other alien societies as their own. It's like mirror imaging
Mirror
in a way
image,
that
yeah, exactly.
just because Xi Jinping is the great leader, everyone has to rally around him. But in other countries, Duterte, for example, in the Philippines, he's the president, but it doesn't mean that everyone rallies around him. So there is,
Yeah.
to me, quite a bit of a mirror imaging that what I see as the cause of the hubris in Chinese foreign policy pertaining to the South China Sea and with particular respect to the Philippines. But with that, no, I really appreciate. I don't really mind the time because I really love talking to you, Richard. The last time we had a face-to-face talk was one of the Shangri-La dialogues, and after
Yeah.
that, we did have really a chance to speak that deeply. So I really appreciate the chance that you give me on your show, give me a platform to share my views, and I very much look forward to sharing more and discussing more and learn from you, my good friend. And hopefully, when you come to Singapore, please let me know. Then I could play good host to you as well.
I feel guilty because I was in Singapore at least twice or three times in the past year, but I didn't want to disturb you. That's the thing. People don't know. Actually, I'm shy. I mean, I know it's not obvious, but actually, I'm very shy. Like to ask people, maybe they're busy and all of that. So, but definitely this time I'll trouble you more, my friend. You're absolutely right. We always think that it's just the wolf warrior problem. I think there's also the ostrich diplomacy problem. This complete denial of the reality out there and insisting on a version of reality that is honestly more wishful thinking. And I think that's where we really see the blind side of China, that their strategic narcissism really prevents them from appreciating complex societies. That's why they have very caricaturist view of other countries. We saw the same problem when Putin invaded Ukraine, thinking they're just a bunch of. We see the same problem also with China, the way they treat the Philippines, among others. So that's why I insist we have to force them to see the rough texture of reality, and then from there, let's negotiate an equilibrium. Otherwise,
Yeah.
they're just going to insist on bullying us into submission. But
Yeah.
thankfully, we no longer have a Duterte in power. On that note,
Yeah.
thank you very much, Dr. Colin Ko from Regent School of International Studies, who obviously spoke in his private capacity because I don't want to put him into trouble. Thank you, my friend, and catch up soon. God
Yeah.
bless you.
Catch up soon. Yeah. See you. See you.
Thank you, La.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Inayos ko lang ito. Thank you so much, guys, for this fantastic discussion and all of that. I hope tuloy-tuloy lang itong mga discussion natin on South China Sea issue and all. Let's keep in touch and let's talk more about this. Yun ang gusto natin gawin, no? Get experts from all around the world to shed light on foreign policy, geopolitics, and also issues of democracy and populism. Salamat po. Thank you very much.